On December the 26th, 1864, Abraham Lincoln sent an important letter to General William Sherman congratulating him for his efforts to capture the city of Savannah on the Georgia coast and mark the end of his very famous march to the sea. Lincoln had been notified of this success in a telegram that Sherman had sent on December the 22nd, where he offered Lincoln the city of Savannah as a Christmas present. So in Abraham Lincoln's response to Sherman, he's going to offer his congratulations. He's going to admit that he had been skeptical of this entire plan to march to the sea. And he's also going to continue to prod his commander to seek a total end to the war. Now, this letter and this campaign through Georgia in 1864 had been very important for a number of reasons. The fighting in northern Georgia had been very difficult, and it led to the very strategic capture of the city of Atlanta, which was intended to cripple the Confederates' ability to supply their soldiers who were fighting in other theaters of war throughout the United States. And then when Sherman is going to march through Georgia to the sea, taking the war to the countryside, he's going to present a new opportunity, a new type of war strategy that he's referring to as total war. In 1864, Lincoln had also been engaged in a very heated campaign for re-election in 1864, and the timing of this effort and this fighting in Georgia really does boost Abraham Lincoln to victory in that election in November of 1864. Atlanta had been captured, and newspapers across the country had really heralded this event in September, early September of 1864, as being a great, great victory for the Union and that the end was in sight. And so because the end was in sight, more people had confidence in Lincoln, and they reelected him as the new Republican president in November of 1864 over his competition, who has been one of his former commanders, General George McClellan, who was the Democratic candidate. So in 1864, in this campaign through Georgia, there had been a lot of controversy and decisions that had to be made politically as well as militarily. Here's what Lincoln had to say to Sherman. Executive Mansion, Washington, December the 26th, 1864. My dear General Sherman, many, many thanks for your Christmas gift, the capture of Savannah. When you were about leaving Atlanta for the Atlantic coast, I was anxious, if not fearful, but feeling that you were the better judge and remembering that nothing risked, nothing gained, I did not interfere. So this alludes to the conflict that Sherman had in convincing his superiors, President Abraham Lincoln as Commander-in-Chief, also Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant of the U.S. Army, who was his superior, and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, that this policy, this plan to leave Atlanta, the success that they had had, and move into the unknown, into the countryside of Georgia, to the sea, that was a good idea. There were questions. Lincoln and Grant were concerned that General Hood, who was the Confederate commander of forces in the fighting in northern Georgia, had not effectively been finished off. He had not totally surrendered. He was still, in their minds, roaming loose in northern Georgia and could present some very disastrous possibilities if Sherman were to leave Atlanta. They were concerned that Sherman would be leaving his rear flank exposed, that his supply line would be open to attack, and they were also fearful that if Hood were able to continue his progress through northern Georgia, that he would get into Tennessee and Kentucky that had already been established as strongholds of Union success. And what would that do? It could possibly undo some of the success that the Union had already acquired in those areas of Tennessee and Kentucky. There was also concern that if Hood were able to go even further, that he might challenge the already difficult campaign that Grant was faced with outside of Richmond. Grant would have preferred that Sherman would have continued to finish off Hood and then move back up to Virginia and help him in his fight for Richmond, the Confederate capital. This didn't happen. Sherman continued to press his commanders. He offers his confidence that this total war strategy is going to really change the war, that the Confederate soldiers who were already faced with difficult odds in terms of supplies and were war weary, that if they were worrying about their farms and their families back home in Georgia, they're not going to want to continue to fight up in Virginia or whatever theater of war that they may be engaged in. Sherman, in his words, said that he was set to make Georgia howl. And so he was ultimately given the go-ahead by Lincoln and Grant, and he does continue that march through Georgia. And here's what Lincoln continued with. Now the undertaking being a success, the honor is all yours, for I believe not of us went farther than to acquiesce. And taking the work of General Thomas into the account, as it should be taken, it is indeed a great success. Now Lincoln is referring here to General George Henry Thomas. When Sherman was given the go-ahead to go to the Atlantic coast, Lincoln also, again, has made his wishes known that Hood not be allowed to roam freely. And so Sherman split his army, and he took the majority of his forces with him through Georgia, planning to forage the countryside and not worry about having a supply line that was in danger. He was going to live off the land. He didn't need a supply line. But he left behind the forces of General Henry Thomas, who was a relatively unknown commodity to Grant and to Lincoln, and left him in charge of finishing that job of ending Hood's ability to make war in northern Georgia and in the areas of the other areas of the South. And Thomas was successful. He does capture Hood, and he does cripple his ability to continue to fight. And so that's what Lincoln's acknowledging here. He's acknowledging that, yes, Sherman was correct in his plan, and yes, Henry Thomas, General George Henry Thomas, was the right man for the job to stop the efforts of General Hood. Concerning this idea of total war, which was relatively new, this idea of going into the countryside and dealing with the civilian aspect of your enemy, Lincoln is going to also acknowledge that that was also a good plan and possibly the wave of the future. Here's what he has to say. Not only does it afford the obvious and immediate military advantages, but in showing to the world that your army could be divided, putting the stronger part to an important new service, and yet leaving enough to vanquish the old opposing force of the whole, Hood's army, it brings those who sat in darkness to see a great light. So is this darkness potentially the idea of traditional warfare, and the new light being this idea of total war? That's what I believe is going on here. I believe that Lincoln is acknowledging that this is a new strategy that might be used in other avenues if this war were to continue longer to be a success for the Union. Lincoln is going to now continue to prod his commander to finish the job. This is something that Lincoln has really had a problem with throughout the war, that his commanders would have a successful battle or successful campaign, but they were not putting an end to the war. And so here's how he addresses that with his commander, General Sherman. He says, "But what next? I suppose it will be safer if I leave General Grant and yourself to decide. Please make my grateful acknowledgement to your whole army, officers and men. Yours very truly, A. Lincoln." This is a great example of Lincoln's leadership ability. He has taken an active role in making the military plan, making the strategy plan, but he's also deferred to his commanders who have that better training and that better understanding of a military campaign. Lincoln is showing his ability here. The war is about to come to an end, and he's also making sure that his commanders know that that's what he wants from them.